Zoey was consumed by worry after a passionate night with Blaine, who then mysteriously vanished. Their connection, however, was far from over. Blaine resurfaced unexpectedly, but the reunion was complicated by the presence of another woman, leaving Zoey heartbroken and confused. Zoey, torn between fear for his safety and her own conflicted feelings, found herself drawn into his world once again. Will their unique arrangement survive the emotional and physical distance between them?
She opened her mouth to try to speak, but no words came out.
I'm kidding, don't get all mushy on me.
Blaine's teasing voice instantly pulled Zoey back to reality. Zoey went from floating on a cloud to crashing back down to earth. She rolled her eyes even though he couldn't see her. Since when did you become so fond of joking? Blaine ignored her question. He answered her last question instead, more seriously.
I'm doing well here. The food isn't great, but I'll make do.
I saw on the news that there have been a lot of aftershocks, so you have to be careful, okay? Zoey's concern for him was obvious from the tone of her voice, and Blaine smiled.
I promise I'll be careful and that I will return safely.
He knew that by giving Zoey his guarantee, she would be able to calm down.
Did I wake you up?
Blaine asked her, then continued.
In the future, I'll try my best to call you earlier, but with so many injuries to treat, it might be past midnight by the time I'm done. I'll be doing back-to-back surgeries all day. If it's really late, don't wait for my call.
Blaine knew how hard Zoey worked and wanted to ensure she got enough sleep versus staying up late waiting for his call. Zoey smiled that Blaine was worried about her while in a disaster zone. Her heart felt warm and a bit giddy. No worries, I'll understand if you don't call. Just stay safe.
It's late, go to sleep. You still have to work in the morning.
Blaine coaxed her in a low voice. Zoey nuzzled her head into the blanket and nodded obediently. You should go back and rest as well.
Okay, let's hang up.
Blaine urged her. You hang up first, Zoey replied, smiling. Blaine chuckled into the phone.
Ladies first. As a man of noble character, it wouldn't be chivalrous of me to hang up first.
Fine. Zoey knew that she wouldn't win, so she laughed helplessly. And then I'll hang up first. Good night. After she ended the call, Zoey stared at the phone in her hand for a long time. Her mind reflected on every word Blaine had just said to her. Suddenly, Zoey felt as if she'd gone back in time, and it was 4 years ago. The last voice she had heard every night had been Blaine's when they'd been together. Back then, they'd also been reluctant to end their calls, encouraging each other to hang up first. On his end, Blaine stayed on the phone longer than necessary, making sure Zoey had really hung up. He was admittedly a little disappointed when he realized she had, although he'd insisted. Blaine couldn't help but laugh at himself as he exited the phone booth. He looked around at the deserted street, tightened his coat, and began the trek back to the field hospital. When Blaine returned to their tent, he accidentally woke Jose, who was bunking with him. Jose sat up and looked at Blaine in shock. Where did you go? It's so late. He looked at the time on his phone. It was almost 2 a.m. Blaine took off his gloves and coat and replied lightly, I had to make a call. Jose looked at him in disbelief. A call? Our traffic still hasn't cleared. Where did you go to make this call? How did you get there? Just outside this district, and I walked. It was only a couple of miles away. Blaine replied blandly, obviously unwilling to share the details of his trip with Jose. A couple of miles? Seriously? Dude, it's pitch black outside with rubble everywhere, and you were in surgery for hours. Jose sat up and watched Blaine as he took off his boots and then used his canteen to wet a towel and wash his face. Jose smiled knowingly. Dr. Dexter, I think you went on this late-night jaunt of yours to call Zoey. Am I right? I heard you asked the locals several times today if they knew of anywhere that had phone service. Look at you, so devoted. Blaine glanced at Jose coldly, then threw the wet towel in his hand at Jose's gossipy face when he burst out laughing. It's none of your business. Go back to sleep. Jose grabbed the towel from his face and smiled even more arrogantly. Oh, now I know I'm right. Come on, admit it. You've got it bad for that woman. It's so obvious. But Blaine just got into his sleeping bag, turned off the lantern, and ignored the still laughing Jose. After that first night, Zoey came to expect Blaine's nightly phone calls from Mexico City. His reports were largely positive. Blaine would tell Zoey how many people he'd been able to save on his operating table and the additional good news of rescue operations he heard had been successful. He would also tell her that sufficient supplies were beginning to arrive in the city and that more roads and highways were cleared. Their phone calls were usually no longer than 15 minutes, sometimes much less. Zoey understood that Blaine didn't want to disrupt her sleep, and she knew that the intensity of his days meant he also needed to rest. But she couldn't help wishing they were longer. Zoey had long ago admitted to herself, if not him, how much she missed him. Still, even a short call from Blaine helped to alleviate her worries, and she found that after hearing Blaine's voice each night, she would quickly drift off to sleep after they hung up the phone. Until the night Blaine's phone calls stopped. Zoey waited and waited that night, but Blaine didn't call, and Zoey barely slept. She tried to rationalize not hearing from Blaine. She told herself he was working especially late or had fallen asleep early by mistake, but Zoey couldn't stop her growing dread. By the next evening, as she paced the hospital corridor outside of Max's hospital room, she felt herself growing more and more panicked. She couldn't calm herself down no matter how hard she tried. Seeing that Max was asleep, Zoey slipped into the empty visitors' lounge and changed the TV hanging on the wall to a cable news channel. It was the top of the hour, and Zoey felt a chill go down her spine as she listened to the news anchor report the top story. There is more disturbing news out of Mexico City today as aftershocks of the 8.1 earthquake that devastated the region have continued to be a cause for concern. We are receiving reports that last night at approximately 1 o'clock a.m., another aftershock of 5.1 rocked the city, with 43 new missing persons reported and 4 new deaths adding to the already devastating casualty numbers in the country. Zoey's whole body began to shiver, and it felt as if the entire hospital's temperature had dropped 20 degrees and her hands were cold. The news anchor said the aftershock had hit at 1 o'clock a.m. last night, around the time Blaine usually called her. Could he have been caught in an aftershock? Zoey checked her watch. It was 10 o'clock p.m. She told herself last night was just a fluke, a horrible coincidence, and that he would call tonight. Still shivering, Zoey returned to Max's hospital room and lay down on the bed alongside their son. Max immediately rolled over and snuggled into her, never waking, and Zoey felt some of her chills disappear. She clutched her phone in one hand and wrapped her arms tightly around her sleeping son as she settled in to wait for Blaine to call. If he called. At that thought, Zoey couldn't hold back any longer, and her tears began to flow uncontrollably. Clutching Max, Zoey whispered into his little ear, "Sweetheart, pray with Mommy that Daddy will return home safely." Her voice was choked with sobs. More and more tears flowed as she held her sleeping son. Was it Zoey's fate to have all the people she loved taken away from her one by one? Was she destined to lose both the man she loved and their son? Zoey hardly slept all night. She soaked her pillow with tears and checked her phone more times than she could count. But another night passed with no call from Blaine. She could no longer deny what her gut told her was the truth. Something bad had happened. Those first 2 nights turned into 5 nights with no word from Blaine. It was as if he had vanished from Zoey's life. She had gone to St. Mary's to inquire about their team in Mexico City, but the hospital had no comment. Their only response was that communications out of Mexico City were erratic, and no one in Phoenix knew the exact situation on the ground in Mexico City. It was now the 6th day since Zoey had heard from Blaine, and she was sitting in front of her computer drawing blueprints in a daze. 10 minutes ago, she'd been told by Talon that she had made an error in the budget estimate she had already presented to her client, and the company would have to absorb the cost. It was the first time Zoey had ever made such an error, so Talon had been reasonable, if disappointed. Zoey offered to pay the difference out of her salary, but he'd said that Taylor Interiors would absorb the cost this time, but to be more careful in the future. Talon's thoughtful response only made Zoey feel guiltier. Not being able to control her emotions any longer, Zoey got up from her desk and went to the restroom. She locked the door behind her and cried while tearfully dialing Blaine's cell phone nonstop.
Sorry, the user you dialed is temporarily out of service. Please hang up and try again later.
Beep, beep, beep.
Sorry, the number you dialed is temporarily out of service. Please hang up and...
Zoey pressed the key again and again, and the same cold mechanical voice answered her. The voice sounded to Zoey as if it had come from the depths of hell, and her heart was in excruciating pain. She clutched her phone with both hands and left a message for Blaine while sobbing. Blaine, where are you? Hurry up and call me, okay? I can't do anything without you. I miss you so much. I really miss you so much. I miss you so much. Zoey's words were so choked with sobs, she knew that even if by some miracle Blaine got her message, he wouldn't be able to make out a word she was saying because of her uncontrollable weeping. After work, Zoey went to the supermarket even though she hadn't had an appetite for days. She was pushing her cart down the aisle in a daze when suddenly her cell phone rang. Ring! The ringtone sounded like the voice of hope as it urgently called out to Zoey. Zoey was shocked. She quickly dropped the items in her hands and grabbed her phone out of her purse. When she saw the caller ID, she was overjoyed, and her eyes immediately turned wet as a rush of excited thoughts went through her. The call was from Mexico City. It was the number of the phone booth he used. It was him. It was Blaine. Blaine was fine. Zoey hurriedly pressed the answer button and shouted into the phone, "Blaine!" "Zoey, it's me." A slightly unfamiliar voice responded, causing Zoey to be stunned momentarily. "It's Jose." "Jose?" Zoey immediately became apprehensive. Jose's voice was always high and lively. Why did he sound so depressed today? Why would you call me?" Zoey tried her best to relax her emotions so her tone didn't sound weird. However, her voice shook, betraying her emotions and her nervousness. She clutched the phone in her hands so hard, her fingers turned white. Zoey wanted to lie and sound calm, but she just couldn't. "Have you guessed why I'm calling?" Jose's muffled voice was hesitant. Every word he said was like a sharp blade slicing Zoey's chest, causing her pain. Tears were welling up in her eyes, but she tilted her head back, forcing herself not to cry. The sound was very obvious. "Please, just tell me the truth. How is he? When Zoey asked her question, her tears gushed out like a flood. "Zoey, right now, I'm standing in the phone booth where Dr. Dexter calls you every day." Jose's voice on the other end of the line was choked with sobs, and he had to pause before continuing. "Every night, as soon as he finished his last operation, Dr. Dexter would immediately leave to call you. He wouldn't even stop to eat. He'd walk for nearly 2 hours to this phone booth so he could tell you he was safe. Several times at 2 a.m, I would see him sitting in our tent eating a cold can of tuna fish and crackers. I asked him why he didn't call you after dinner, but he told me he couldn't wait that long." Jose's voice grew hoarser.
6 days ago, after he called you, there was a 5.1 aftershock.
"Since then, we haven't seen Dr. Dexter again." While Jose spoke, Zoey slid down to her knees beside the supermarket shelves with her cell phone in her hand. She covered her mouth and sobbed, ignoring the looks of everyone around her. She had never known that for his phone call every night, Blaine would have to walk back and forth for hours in the dark, devastated streets. He hadn't even cared if he ate or slept, and now, because of her, Blaine was missing. Zoey put her hand into her mouth and bit down hard. She wanted to use the pain between her fingers to numb the pain in her heart. "Zoey, I'm not telling you this to make you blame yourself or to make you feel guilty. I just want to finish this for Dr. Dexter. He wouldn't want you to think he'd forgotten about you." Jose then went silent. Zoey knew that a grown man was crying on the other end of the phone. Finally, Jose spoke again. "We are already doing our best to search for him. If we don't find Dr. Dexter, it means he is still alive. Don't give up hope, Zoey." Zoey didn't remember hanging up the phone or how she got out of the supermarket, but Jose's words still echoed in her ears. She walked for hours as if doing so would somehow bring her closer to Blaine, as he'd spent hours walking for her. By the time Zoey returned home, her legs burned and her back ached, but she barely noticed because of the roaring pain in her heart. "Zoey!" When Gloria saw Zoey walk in, she paled. She had never seen her strong daughter look so broken. Zoey, what's wrong? What's wrong with you? Has something happened? As soon as Zoey heard her mother's voice, her tears gushed out like a flood. Honey, what's wrong with you? You're scaring Mom. Zoey looked at her mother in a daze, unable to hold it in any longer. She threw herself into her mother's embrace and broke into fresh tears. Mom, I feel so bad. Zoey sobbed, clutching her heart, which was in extreme pain. She wished that she could cut it out with a knife. That way she might feel better. She was the one who endangered Blaine. If it weren't for her, Blaine wouldn't have gone to that place to call her and been caught in an aftershock.
Zoey confronted Blaine, demanding the truth about his vanishing act and the mysterious woman. As secrets unraveled, Blaine revealed a dangerous mission that had kept them apart, but his love for Zoey remained unwavering. Together, they chose to rebuild their trust, proving their connection could withstand any distance or obstacle. Hi, Zoey here. If you are wondering what happens next, then download the Pocket FM app and listen to the exciting episodes of Rekindled Heartache now.